Welcome to the Convex Conversation with me, broadcaster Helen Fospero. The importance of a healthy gut, what we consume, and the benefits of food rich in nutrients feels as though it's becoming much more talked about. But the reams of advice we're bombarded with can sometimes be overwhelming and difficult to navigate. As a food lover, talking about it can even sometimes take the joy out of what should be one of our greatest pleasures. This week's guest is Italian-born, from a culture where food symbolises happiness and brings people together. And she's an expert in the science behind nutrition, which can help us enjoy optimum health at all stages of our lives. Dr. Federica Amati is a medical scientist and head nutritionist at ZOE, and perhaps the seeds of her path in life were sown and inspired by her early years growing up in Rome. She works with individuals, helping change their lives for the better, is head nutritionist at WellFounded, and teaches medical students at Imperial College London, sharing some pretty shocking stats to illustrate her lifestyle medicine and prevention module. For example, 1 in 5 deaths globally and 80% of chronic disease could be prevented with improved diet. The world's biggest killers like cancer and heart disease are driven by 3 major factors: smoking, sedentary lifestyles, and, you guessed it, diet. Her new book, Everybody Should Know This, with the emphasis on body, is packed full of knowledge, tips and insights. Dr. Federica, so lovely to meet you. I've heard a lot about you from my early morning walks with Dr. Kreindler, who you work with at WellFounded. Am I right in thinking this is a particularly exciting time in your field?
Yeah, hi Helen, it's so nice to be here, and any friend of Jack's is a friend of mine. Yeah, it is an exciting time. I think for the first time in a very long time, nutrition science is taking its rightful place as a real science. For decades, it was thought of as a sort of complementary medicine or complementary thing, whereas now it's very clear that the majority of chronic diseases are driven primarily by a poor diet. In fact, nowadays, when you look at primary drivers of non-communicable chronic diseases, so as you mentioned, cancer, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, the strongest driver is now diet, whereas 50 years ago, it was smoking. So we now live in a world where poor diet is the biggest risk factor for ill health. And so as a consequence, nutrition has suddenly become really quite important. And understanding nutrition and its role in preventing disease, but also in maintaining health and improving quality of life is become, every year the interest grows. And the fact that I'm now teaching medical students at Imperial College is such a good sign, because up until 5 years ago, we weren't teaching them at all. They didn't have any nutrition education. So it's all moving in the right direction. And it means that people like myself who have taken this science quite seriously, so spent a lot of my time at university understanding this, it means that there's space for that science to evolve and for more people to become better educated on the topic, not only for themselves, but also for their clinical practice, for public health interventions, for how we design our schools. There's so many things that are touched by nutrition and what we eat and how we eat, that I think it's only the beginning of quite how big this sector is going to become.
It's so nice to hear that you're teaching medical students. I have a friend who's a very eminent doctor, and he talked to me about his 7 years studying to be a GP. And he asked me to guess how much time he spent on nutrition in 7 years. And I don't think you'll be surprised to learn it was half a day.
I mean, that's more than
most.
That's more than most, yeah. So historically, nutrition just wasn't a module. So it wasn't part of any of the formal education. Now, of course, there are plenty of doctors who then have gone on to take the time themselves to train. So actually, what's also been nice to see is that some of the more senior doctors, consultants, they have trained themselves. They've sort of gone and seeked that additional training. But that's only people who are really driven to do so. Traditionally trained consultants nowadays, who are consultants today, would not have had a formal part of their curriculum addressing nutrition. And I think that's important to bear in mind, because oftentimes, people are quite mean about doctors, and they're like, my doctor never mentioned this. How could they not mention this? It's because traditionally medical education has centered around what medical interventions can save lives. And prevention hasn't been a big part of the conversation. And nutrition hasn't either. Neither has mental health, neither has sleep. So it's not that the doctors don't care. It's just that the practice of medicine is really changing at the moment. And for those who were trained many years ago, so who are now consultants because it takes a long time to get there. It wasn't part of their formal training. And it's not because they're mean people. It's just that that's not the medicine they've been trained to do. And I think what's interesting as well is that really, if you do break a leg or you are having a heart attack or you do have a car crash, like that medical intervention training will save your life. So there's still like a huge value in that. It's just that hopefully now something we've been talking about in public health. So I primarily trained in public health. I got my master's in public health in 2010, and that was my primary interest. And we've been talking about prevention since way before my time. So prevention in public health has been something that we've sort of been drumming on about for a while. And it's now looking like it's becoming part of that conversation for medicine too. It just takes a long time to change these things because population health doesn't shift overnight. And before you start to change the entire way you approach healthcare, you have to really see which trends are going to stick, which aren't, and then understand like what the best way to approach it is, because there's only so much you can fit on a medical curriculum as well. So if you're increasing nutrition hours, what are you taking off?
Of course, you're taking off something, I suppose, to make room. What was it about public health that sparked your imagination and made you want to go down that route? Because as you say, I guess it's like moving the Queen Mary. It's going to be very slow and tricky to bring about change.
Originally, when I was younger, so in my teens, I really wanted to do medicine. So I spent all my summers working in hospitals. I spent my weekends volunteering at hospitals. I was absolutely fascinated with helping people, medicine. How can we improve people's lives? How can we help people to feel better? As you'll have seen in my book, I lived with my grandparents. We're Italian, we moved them in. So a lot of my life was around how can I improve like the quality of life of my grandparents? And when I volunteer, how can I do something useful? So what then happened is that I didn't end up doing medicine in like one of life's plot twists. But I knew that I wanted to understand more about the body and how it works and why disease happens. And so instead of sort of taking a year out and doing it again, the exams again, I went and did biomedical sciences to just do the science bit. And I was like, I can do that. And then I can either do postgraduate clinical training, which is very normal in the US, and you can do it in the UK now as well. Or I can see what happens. And essentially during that time, I became very interested in like the medical system, and my friends who had gone off to do medicine, like listening to their stories of how they train and how they learn. I became very interested in that. And I just thought, it's not what I think, like it's not how I thought it would happen, if that makes sense. And I'd done quite a lot of work experience in Italian hospitals. And what became really clear was that if I was going to study medicine in the UK, the experience of a junior doctor in the UK is wildly different to the experience of a junior doctor in Italy.
Is it?
Yeah. So then I thought, do I want to do that? To be completely honest. 2010, there was a big reform of the NHS and Public Health England. Lots of things changed. It was very unstable. The reason I did public health was because what I was hearing a lot from my peers was doing medicine is great, but it's really hard because by the time you see someone, they're already very sick and you wish that you could have done something earlier. So I was like, well, how do you act upstream? How do I do that bit? And so that's what public health is. And that public health is not a sexy job title that people know about like in their teens, right? It's lawyers, it's doctors, it's actors, it's these big name jobs. And someone said, you'd probably like public health. I was like, what on earth is public health? And they were saying it's population medicine. So you have to understand disease. You have to understand how it happens. And physiology is really useful to know. But you're essentially seeing like what are the factors that are impacting population health. And that just struck a chord with me. I thought that sounds fascinating. So I went off and did that master's. And it was during that master's I was particularly interested in non-communicable diseases, so chronic diseases, things that aren't infectious disease, because that is what most of us in the UK will develop and die of. And it's also actually what the majority of the world is going to develop and die of nowadays. So there's this big shift in epidemiology where infectious disease used to be a massive driver across the world, and now more and more chronic diseases are taking over as the primary cause of disability and death. And I just found that fascinating, because the thing about chronic diseases is that they are preventable. They are something that develops as a result of chronic exposures in your life. And so I was being taught by this professor called Elio Riboli, who's a bit of a legend in public health. He started the EPIC cohort, which is the biggest cohort that looks at diet and cancer in the world. So that he's got over 500,000 people he's been following for like over 30 years all over Europe. And he was teaching, I was very lucky, he was teaching us about some of the findings that they'd had from this massive piece of work that's still ongoing. And he was saying, so what we obviously found was that people who consumed more processed meats developed more cancer, especially cancer of the colon. As he was saying, I was slack-jawed. I was like, we know this and we've done nothing. And then he was explaining how that research then fed into the WHO's update of making sort of processed meats a class 1 carcinogen. So how his research had changed guidelines, say. And I just remember watching this lecture and I was kind of looking around the room like, is anyone else? No? Anyone else think this should be front page news, that people should know this? And those was one of the moments where I just thought, gosh, if food has this power to directly cause and impact health outcomes in this way, like what else is missing? Like what else do I know? So in that moment, I still didn't know at that time that nutrition was a thing. Like I didn't really know it was a degree. Imperial College, actually, I did my master's at Imperial, and they don't offer nutrition as a degree. So they still don't, actually. That will change, I think. But
I'm going to make sure that changes.
Yeah. So it wasn't in my sphere, because the natural progression when you do a master's at a university like Imperial is that you stay and you carry on in that space. So what I'd actually signed up to do was to then do, Elio Riboli had a master's in metabolomics. And he was like, if you're really interested, would you like to do that? And so I was like, maybe I'll do another master's. And then I thought, actually, I've been in education quite a long time, Helen. By this point, I was still very young, but I was like, I kind of feel like I just need a break. So I took a break from academia at this point. So I'd become a research assistant. I was with the WHO Collaborating Centre at Imperial College, but I just felt like I needed some different experience. My professor was very supportive. And he said, go and do something else and then come back when you're ready, kind of thing. And I was like, I will. But I had this seedling of the power of food had been planted in my mind. And I started becoming very interested in how food impacts health. So I then went off and had like a mini career in communications, which actually then describes a lot of what I do now. But I went off and I worked in communications in New York and did a completely different job. Like absolutely nothing to do with, no science involved. But it was really interesting to me because I'm naturally quite sociable and I like writing. My A-levels, 2 of my A-levels were history and English literature. So in that job, I was able to really use that skill set and be creative in my work. So I was able to pull together some amazing events and work with artists. And it was really fabulous in that sense. But what it also taught me is that I have a passion for health. So whilst I was sort of writing, I was speaking with Vogue about writing up some fantastic new launch that we'd just done. I just thought, gosh, I wish that actually what Vogue was writing about was the importance of these factors for health. I wish that we could actually put something useful in Vogue, right? I remember thinking this in my head. It was a very specific core memory of mine. And so that's when I decided, I said, somehow what I'd love to do is to have a job that allows me to communicate science and important research updates to the public so that they can use that to improve their health. And I didn't know how that was going to happen, but safe to say, I came back to London. I applied to do my PhD at the School of Public Health. I wanted to get back into the mix. I got my PhD opportunity. Now, again, I went back to my alma mater. I went back to Imperial, and I said I would love to do something that really looks at improving health outcomes in a way that makes sense to me. And they said, well, we don't have anything looking at nutrition, but we've got this really big data analysis PhD that is going to look at a huge mental health data set. And I'd never done mental health before. I also don't love data analysis, but I was like, do you know what? Sounds like a challenge. Let's take it. So I then did that, and I looked at how can we predict patient outcomes? Because that's something that we use across science. When you get that sort of approach, you can use that to predict outcomes for any intervention. So in this case, I was looking at mental health and trying to understand, like, what are the factors in people's lives that predict how well they're going to respond to an intervention, to treatment. And that's what I became interested in and did my PhD, found a new way of measuring patient outcomes that wasn't just related to disease scales. So a thread in all of my research, my very first paper I published was looking at patient-centered care. Something that I'm passionate about is making sure that we measure things in a way that actually makes sense to the person you're treating. And so this is what happened with my PhD as well. I said, we're measuring people's health outcomes, in this case, mental health, just by looking at these scales of depression and anxiety, which are really important and validated. But actually, there's a whole subset of people that have improved social function, improved quality of life, and we're deeming them as a failure of treatment because we're not measuring those other metrics. And so that was a really obviously amazing piece of work. PhDs are really hard. Don't do one unless you're sure. But it was wonderful. And during that time, because I was in academia at this point, I had the freedom to explore other areas that were interesting to me. And so whilst I was doing my PhD, I was able to train more in nutrition. So I did a course in Cambridge University, which is the NEDPro. It's called the NEDPro Foundation Certificate in Human Nutrition. Then I started doing some research in nutrition. So it all sort of self-propagated. My department wasn't doing this, so I was like, I'm just going to do it myself. And I started doing research. I published my first review, which was a nutrition review looking at maternal diet and health outcomes. So how maternal diet impacts health outcomes for the mother and the baby. Then from that point, I knew that I was going to do another degree in nutrition. So when I finished my PhD, one of my professors said, you don't really need to do another degree. You've got the PhD, you've got public health, you've done the research. She was like, you don't need to do any more. And I said, no, but I think it's important that I do, because I might do this degree and I might hopefully know quite a lot of it, but I want to make sure that I do it by the book, because it's such an important science. And there are so many people in the world who call themselves a nutritionist and have done 0 hours of actual research or practice in nutrition. So I don't want to be another one of those. Even though I've done lots of science and I'm qualified, I want to qualify in that science. And so I went off and I did the Masters in Nutrition at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Best year of my life in terms of education, what an amazing university. So then I was able to register with the Association for Nutrition as an associate nutritionist. Now I'm a registered nutritionist. And what I'm hoping in the future is that nutritionist will become a protected title, and that only those who have gone through that process and who register with the Association for Nutrition and keep the registration up to date, because you have to prove your skills every year, that will be protected. Because at the moment, anyone can go and call themselves a nutritionist without the need to show anything. Having just told you what I've told you in terms of the power of food on our health, that shouldn't be the case. It's very confusing for the public to not know where to look.
What a journey you've gone through to get to this point. Your love of teaching and experimenting, though, started when you were really little in Italy, and I think perhaps inspired by your nonna, who was a teacher, and mum, I think, was a medical doctor, dad an inventor, so you were around a very creative family. What are your memories of that time and you being this kind of little teacher as a little girl?
Even as I was a bit older, actually, I just remember if I'd learned something new, I would go up to my mum and be like, Mummy, guess what I learned today? Did you know that? And invariably, especially my mum would know. My mum is unbelievably bright, and her ability to know things, her knowledge base is insane. In some ways, I'm very similar to her, but of course, she's got years on me. So every time, even when I was at university and I was studying, I did my honours in pharmacology, my first degree, biomedical sciences, honours in pharmacology, and I specialised in endocrine pharmacology, which is quite specific. Yes. But even then, I'd say to her, did you know about this amazing enzyme called H-beta SD1 or whatever? And she'd be like, yeah, really interesting. And did you see? And she'd then tell me something else she knew about it. And I'd be like, oh my God.
It's your nickname, Maestrina in those days.
Yeah.
Maestrina. What does that mean?
It means little teacher, literally. So it just came from my love of telling anyone who would listen, right, what my latest discovery was. And it often came from books. I also liked to write my own stories, but I really valued learning from places of authority, which in my mind were books or teachers. So if I'd learned something new, I would just be like, guess what I learned today? Did you know this? And it's that, did you know that? It was just amazing, isn't it? Like, do you know that?
You're doing it in a different way now, but, with your book and things like that, yeah. And obviously seeing all your clients. Those early years in Rome, I'm guessing you were eating delicious seasonal food probably, and lots of fresh olive oil and very few ultra-processed foods. To go for a little bit of a dive through different stages in life and different foods, can we start with ultra-processed products and how bad they are for us, and yet they're everywhere, staring us in the face whenever we walk into a supermarket or shop?
I like that you call them ultra-processed products. Sometimes it's a useful distinction between...
They're not foods, are they?
Well, it's tricky, Helen, because for a lot of people, they make up the majority of their diet. So saying they're not food is counterintuitive when people's majority of their calories are coming from these products. But you're completely right in the sense that they're manufactured and they are food products because they're really there to get you to buy them as opposed to actually nourish you. So I agree with you. But it's a very polarizing topic. And I think that's because it's hard to understand. For regular shopper to be going around the supermarket, the contrast between the marketing and advertising the food tells you and then actually understanding what the back of pack label is telling you is often completely contradictory. So there are so many products that on the front say high in calcium, a source of iron, added vitamin D, like all these things that in our minds are good things. And you're like, great, so this product is going to give me all of these benefits. But then when you turn the pack around and you see there's like 55 ingredients and no fiber and loads of salt and actually lots of things that we don't need to eat in our diet. That's a direct contrast. So on one side, the packet is encouraging you to buy this product, but then with a bit of knowledge, when you flip it over, all the science tells us you shouldn't buy it. So there's this real tension between what we know is good for health and what sells a product. I think we're at this pivot point now where because of books, because of lots of people speaking out about this, public sentiment has changed and people are a bit outraged, as they should be, that we live in a food environment that is stacked against our health. That's quite a big deal because why? How's it happened that we live in an environment that's stacked against our health? So what it tells us is that public health, the health of the nation, is not a priority for our politicians because they have not put policies in place to protect our health instead of protecting profit for these companies. And sometimes people think it's too strong to make this comparison, but honestly, the closest comparison to this in our history is smoking, where for many years, smoking was advertised as being good for you. And actually, your doctor was advertising smoking on the billboards. And there was a lot of genuinely pushing smoking as a healthy habit. When the data came out that clearly showed how smoking causes cancer and is directly causing thousands and millions of deaths, it still took a long time for the environment to not be advertising smoking to us. I mean, I remember smoking adverts. You will remember too, like in films, smoking was allowed to be glamorized in films all the time. So it's very similar to that. It's so pervasive and it's so normal for people to be eating these foods. And even though we have the data to show that it's negative, it's having a negative impact on health, a negative impact on mental health. It's a negative impact on children's health outcomes if you're pregnant. It's a negative impact on your fertility. Like, name it, and it's a negative impact. The more of these foods you eat, the worse the outcome.
I hope I didn't sound snotty when I said they're not food because, over the years before I became a bit more informed, like I'd like to think I am now through various friends I'm surrounded by, I've eaten my share and fed my young children on all sorts of ultra-processed food. It's only, I suppose, as I've got more awareness and I'm aware now of what's in them and things like emulsifiers and things that are certainly not good and indeed maybe harmful for our health, that I've got more aware of it. That's something that's going to take a long time to shift too, isn't it? And of course, there's finance involved too, that a lot of the ultra high processed food can be for many families cheaper than trying to make something from scratch. Because if you make something from scratch, it can be expensive trying to get all the veg or whatever you need to actually make something.
Yeah. And you're completely right as well, though. And it's not I don't think you came across it as well. I just think it's an interesting point to raise because for many people, there's gradients. So baked beans is my favorite example. It's an ultra processed food, but it's definitely a food. There's definitely beans in there. And on the grand scale of things, We don't eat enough beans, full stop. So if baked beans are your bean, great. Like, let's go, keep going, because there's more benefit. So one of the things that we touched on was just like how useful the classification is for shoppers. The NOVA system, which is what we use for research, is not that intuitive for shopping. And so what we want to do and what we're working on at ZOE is how can we make this easier to understand so that it's actually useful for people who aren't just doing research, but who actually have to do their shop.
So will there be labels that will tell you how good something is for you?
Some countries in South America have done that. So in Chile, for example, there are warning signs on ultra-processed foods like there are on cigarette packets here. It's like a black sticker with like a do not buy this, basically, on ultra-processed foods. That has helped shift, guess what, consumer behavior, because they're like, that's got the sticker, I'm not going to buy it. Doesn't matter if it says high in vitamin D and a source of calcium, like I'm not buying it. So there's very simple stuff like that, which just makes it very easy. But then individual agency is important. People understanding this is important. Being able to read a label and make a decision is important. But you know what I think is more important is for our politicians to take it more seriously and to actually make it easier, because it shouldn't be cheaper to eat an ultra-processed food diet. That's not the case in other European countries. So if we like just take our head out of the sand for a minute and look around, countries like Italy and France and Spain and Greece, you can eat a minimally processed diet with a much lower GDP than we have in the UK. So actually, is that the reason? No. Like, government has to put this in place as a priority and actually say, right, yeah, let's change this food environment. Because guess what? The UK and the US have the crappiest food environments in the world. So, okay, what are we going to do about it? Are we going to just sit there and let it happen? Or should we actually stick around? Let's see what others are doing. Let's prioritize whole foods. Let's make sure that people have enough money to buy these whole foods. Or let's make sure that these whole foods are the ones that are subsidized by the government so that they are cheaper for everyone to enjoy. There's lots of strands that need to happen. There's education, there's reducing advertising.
Schools as well, as our children understand a lot more about nutrition, probably because of me banging on about it at tea time. But my son said to me the other day, why am I learning chemistry, for example, which he's not very interested in, yet I'm leaving school with no idea about nutrition, finance, all that kind of thing. Yeah. It's a shame it's not taught. It's a shame it's not a module or something, so that you can learn the basics of science and the basics of what you can eat more of and less of, and how that will impact your health and certain illnesses and how you can perhaps prevent illnesses. The nervous system that regulates our gut, I know, has long been seen by scientists as our second brain, but that's another thing that, thanks to ZOE, which you can tell us a bit about as well, we are becoming much more of our gut health, and we're using that word microbiome. Why is our gut so important for good health?
Our gut is, apart from our skin and like our external part, our gut is the bit of us that comes into contact with the external elements and processes it. So the whole tube from mouth to anus is essentially an external tube, because everything that touches it actually comes from outside, right? And then it acts as a sort of barrier to what's going to be let through. So the gut is so important because it's another way our body understands what's going on outside that isn't information that we get through our eyes or our touch or our hearing. Those are obviously all very useful and for us to understand our environment. But when it comes to understanding like what we've eaten, what we've ingested, is it good? Is it bad? Do we need to react? And our immune system, unless you get a cut, so unless you cut your skin and therefore there's a breach in the barrier, which then results in inflammation and the immune system activating. The way that our immune system understands most of what's going on the inside is through our gut. So 70% or more, we think more now, of our immune tissue and immune cells are just lying on the outside of our gut. Imagine the small intestine and the large intestine are surrounded by an external layer of like just immune system cells waiting for information. That is the fundamental thing to understand when we're trying to understand why gut is so important. So that immune system priming that happens from our gut is what helps babies and toddlers and infants to develop a healthy immune system. So the exposures that they have, the beginning of our lives, our gut is extremely plastic. The gut microbiome composition changes wildly. It's like all over the place. And it settles into like an adult-like microbiome fingerprint at age 3.
Oh, at age 3. Gosh, that is young, isn't it?
And so what's interesting is like one of the ways this was first discovered was there was some research from Harvard which looked at the difference in gut microbiome composition between children who were exposed to antibiotics multiple times before the age of 2 and those who weren't. So we know that in the first 3 years of life, the microbiome is extremely plastic, and what happens to it changes the course of like what's going to happen in terms of microbiome composition. Now, this includes factors like were you born vaginally or were you born with cesarean section, where vaginal birth basically lends the newborn a microbiome fingerprint from the mother, whereas a cesarean section results in microbes from the skin of the surgeon or whoever, like of the obstetrician. That's a completely different microbiome with these children between cesarean section and vaginal delivery. And then as we continue, like, are they breastfed or are they formula fed? That's another big fork in the road. If you're breastfed, your gut microbiome composition is completely different to if you're formula fed. And formula feeding does not offer a fraction of the complementary proteins, the immune system cells, and the things that the microbes need to ferment, the prebiotics, that breast milk does. There's lots of forks in the road. And when you get to about 3, you will have this initial adult microbiome fingerprint. And that is how your immune system practices. So your immune system in your earlier years, while it's forming, in infancy, our immune system is forming and is trying to understand like what's harmful, what's not. But we don't mount immune responses in early life. That's why we have vaccinations are really important, because you need to be able to prime the immune system just in case something does happen. But in breastfed infants, the maternal milk microbiome basically acts as a surrogate immune system. And then eventually your own immune system starts to kick in and build up defenses. And when we have exposures that trigger the immune system unnecessarily, that's when you start to see allergies. And what's interesting about allergies is that children who are exposed to more foods earlier in life have less of a chance of allergies. This is why now we recommend eating peanuts, eating eggs, eating wheat during pregnancy and during breastfeeding and early in life. Because the more you expose your microbiome to things that are not harmful and that are just part of food, they're like in their training saying, okay, this one's good. We've seen this one before. I think it's fine. Let's keep going. So it's like, think of it that way. It's like a training ground. Now, when we understand the training ground for immune system, and you think ahead to like adulthood, early childhood. So early childhood, there's this massive growth of all the lymphatic tissues. So all the lymphatic tissues that are the pathways of the immune system, they have a huge growth spurt around the age of 6. So the initial training ground has been set. And now there's this big burst of like lymphatic tissue everywhere and inflammation. Like, where do we need more stations for possible inflammation? All these kinds of things. So if you think that the gut helps to train what then goes on to become that immune system. In adulthood and later life, training continues every time you're exposed to a new virus or a new pathogen. But if you don't maintain that healthy communication point between the gut microbiome and the immune system, then what happens is you're at a much higher risk of dysregulation of the immune system. And when the immune system doesn't work in the way that it should, it's not just a risk of suffering more with infection. So yeah, absolutely. You're more likely to catch infections. You're more likely to suffer with them for longer, and you're more likely to maybe not recover as well or take longer to recover. But also crucially, if it's dysregulated, if it's not working properly, it's also more likely to become auto-inflammatory. And so when we think about the immune system and the gut microbiome, what we're looking for is this like co-regulation where the gut microbiome is really happy. It's got lots of fiber. It's got lots of helpful microbes that are making lots of helpful chemicals that communicate with the immune system to say, everything is good. We're in a good place. Nothing to worry about. Don't worry about inflammation right now. We don't need it.
So on a practical front, what can we do to, there's a lot of talk about pre and probiotics. Should we supplement? Can we add things to our food? What can we do as adults that can just help that microbiome be happy and not put any alerts out?
Yeah, so primarily it's a diversity of foods, a diverse range of foods. And the majority of our food on our plate should be plants. Simple as that. Half of your plate should be plants. And that includes mushrooms and aubergines and leafy greens and fruits and nuts and seeds and whole grains. So I'm not just saying, eat a bag of salad.
That would be very boring, wouldn't it?
That would, yeah. I mean, I love a salad, but, too much of
Me
too
too,
much. Too much of one thing.
Much.
There's so many plants, and everyone has lost touch with what it means to actually cook with plants. Not everyone, but there's a big disconnect between what it means, and it's actually delicious. And now oftentimes it's easy right? So it's become easy thanks to things like jarred beans, tinned lentils, which, unlike the ultra processed foods, are actually very helpful and healthy because they are just basically boiled and put in a jar and makes it easier to just pop them in a bowl, put them in the microwave. Even if you don't have time to cook, you can make a meal with a few ingredients. So fiber-rich foods, lots of plants, and then really looking to healthy fats. So our gut microbes love omega-3 fatty acids. They break them down too, and they love them. So the fatty fish, and that doesn't just mean salmon. Everyone's freaking out about salmon at the moment. It means mackerel, it means anchovies, it means herring, sardines, eel, shellfish. Omega-3 is found in so many different types of fish. And if you don't eat fish, there are alpha-linoleic acids, which are found in seeds, which are the precursors to omega-3 fatty acids. So they're like the plant versions, in the same way that actually the omega-3 fatty acids found in fish come from the seaweed that they eat, right? So it takes more to get enough from ALAs. So you have to really think about it if you're vegan, but it's possible to do. And if not, like a little bit of oily fish twice a week, maybe 3 times if it's low, will get you enough because it's very easy to absorb.
And fermented food, I can't get my head around fermented food.
Really?
I'm tried. I'm not a kimchi girl. And I was talking to somebody about it in Health the other day, and I said I don't really like it. And he went, as I said, a bit of that on your plate every day will be helpful. But fermented food's good, isn't it?
They are really good.
Kind of thing.
Fermented foods seem to have, so we talked about fiber has this really good immunomodulatory effect. So it helps the immune system to function properly. But in a really beautiful study done in University of Stanford, they looked at the difference between high fiber and high fermented foods. And fermented foods, on top of like being high in fiber a lot of the time, they actually help to reduce unwanted inflammation. Inflammation is the base for so many chronic diseases. So even you were talking about the gut nervous system, so the enteric nervous system, the way it connects to the brain is through the vagus nerve. And that gut-brain connection, so much of that is also hinging on inflammation. Where there's higher inflammation in the gut, it changes that communication to the brain.
And this is where food can help as well, isn't
Yes.
it? In terms of reducing inflammation, which I'm guessing is at the heart of many diseases.
Yes.
Even Alzheimer's, I think, isn't it?
Yes. Inflammatory status and this low-grade chronic inflammation is basically implicated in all chronic disease, right? So chronic low-grade inflammation of the pancreas for diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and chronic low-grade inflammation of the colon cancer, chronic low-grade inflammation of the brain, dementia and Alzheimer's. So now there's some newer theories around inflammatory status and depression, for example. So we need to nurture the gut, its connection with the immune system for this inflammation. And foods like fermented foods and a high fiber diet also help to regulate that. It's all part of the same picture, and it's crucial for understanding how to maintain good health. So whilst we're unpicking like the individual mechanisms and how it happens, it's beautiful, it's really fascinating. But it always goes back to this high plant diet, minimally processed, high in fiber, and with healthy fats such as omega-3 and poly and monounsaturated fatty acids from walnuts, from extra virgin olive oil, from olives, from nuts. What I'm telling you is not new information for a healthy diet. All that's happening is that wisdom of what a healthy diet constitutes of, we now understand the mechanism why. So we understand more of why the Mediterranean diet seems to help everything from depression to arthritis to like why the gut, and why at ZOE we have the largest gut microbiome database in the world. And we are managing to unpick and understand what does a gut microbiome look like when it is being fed a really good diet and it's resulting in good health outcomes that we want to see. How do we understand that? And then once we understand what it should look like, how do we understand what we can do to change the composition towards a healthier one? And that's exactly what we're doing. Well, we've done some of the science. We've published over 30 papers in peer-reviewed journals. And one of the recent ones called Method was a randomized controlled trial where we actually saw how doing ZOE, becoming a ZOE member and actually taking part in like the daily understanding of food, what to add to your plate, can shift your gut microbiome composition in a few weeks. to something much better for you.
Very, very exciting.
It's really exciting. Yeah.
It's really exciting. Your book, which I've found, I've just kind of got it on the side as a bit of a guide now, and I dip in and out of it. It's dedicated to your young daughters. And the line I really loved in it, Federica, was where you say that becoming their mother made you fall in love with the wonders of the human body. That's such a wonderful thing to say, but also for them to reflect on as they grow up.
Yeah, I mean, always been fascinated with the human body, but for me, pregnancy and giving birth to a live human.
With no manual, by the way. I didn't get a manual with mine.
Yeah. No, mine didn't come in. It just, like, how amazing the human body is, like what it's capable of. Like becoming a mother, for me, cemented that in a very tangible way. So theoretically, yes, it was already there. But I think a lot of mothers will say this, but it was just such a huge moment of, it continues to be as they grow, of just what the wonder of like the human body, even just watching them grow and seeing how quickly they're changing their physical abilities. And it's just wild, isn't it? It's a wild ride. And
it is.
And it's something that for me was a very profound thing. And my relationship with my body massively changed after becoming a mother, because what just happened was incredible. You know, to grow a whole organ that then grows a whole child and keeps it alive and actually healthy. And you know, it's a miracle. It is a miracle. So
it is. It is an absolute miracle. We've talked a bit about the early years. I guess the first 1,000 days are really important. I think puberty and adolescence, I like the fact you called those the roller coaster years. But can good nutrition also help with longevity? And not just, you know, my granddad died at 100. He was born in 1894. So I'm planning to be beyond 100. But I want to be well and beyond 100. And I want to be doing the same kind of things as I'm doing now, which drives me to eat as well as I can and to try and shop at markets where I can and try and get proper food. But can it help us live longer if we eat well?
Yeah, absolutely. What's really clear is that if you want to live a long and healthy life, diet is the most powerful factor. I would say that a close second in terms of living a long and independent life is physical activity. So I often say to people, you know, if you want to be 89 and climbing the stairs and doing the gardening, then at 39, you need to be able to do that like 50 times better. So I think often, or sometimes, younger people will be like, oh, you know, when I have more time, I'll do it. And actually, that doesn't work so well. Of course, there are wonderful stories of people who've turned their health around and their physical ability around at 70, and it's really inspiring to see, and it's completely possible. But I think for the majority of us, putting those practices into place earlier in life is a lot easier than starting later. And it's the same with nutrition. So there's been recently, some papers made quite a big splash on media, because they talked about how your diet aged 46 was the best predictor of whether you would have dementia aged like 69. And so a lot of the questions I got was asked is, what if I'm 53? I was like, well, that's not really the point of the paper. The point of the paper, though, was to say that the impact of dietary patterns is a compound effect. So the earlier you start with having the dietary patterns that you want to have to support your health, the better your outcome. Now, there's also other analysis that's shown that if you change your diet at the age of 70, you can improve your longevity. So it's never too late, but it's just the earlier you start, the more you're going to get out of it, the more of a beneficial outcome. And that still stands, even if you then end up developing like a cancer earlier in life. So the longevity space is really interesting, because you have a group of people who are really hyper-focused on metrics and essentially being an athlete at like 92, which is fascinating, but definitely like the 1%, I think, of people. The rest of the conversation is, I've done all this stuff, but I still got this cancer aged 60. Or my grandma, I love these ones, my grandfather or my grandmother smoked until the age of 96 and had a whiskey every day. It's like, you know, what we're saying is that if you eat well for your health, then you support your health with food. And if you move in a way that keeps your body functionally able, so I'm not talking about becoming an Olympian, but functionally, can you squat down? Can you pick things up? Can you run? Then what you're doing is you're setting yourself up for the best possible outcome, regardless of what life then throws at you. You can't predict that bit. And also, diet can't always protect your risk from diseases, because we all start from different baseline risk. And it's very hard to calculate that baseline risk, because you need to look at genetics, family history, early life exposures, which most of us don't know about. So it's so hard to calculate your baseline risk, but everything you invest in terms of diet and physical activity, social connection, and mental health will just make whatever outcome better. Whatever happens along the way will be improved if your initial health bank is well deposited. And so that's how I look at it.
Do you, just as we kind of draw to a close, do you get great pleasure in seeing the difference that you make, perhaps with some of your individual clients or people you work with at WellFounded and ZOE? Is that why you get up in the morning in terms of your work, to see that you can literally change people's lives and help them?
Yes, to be honest, I'm very motivated by any small piece of feedback from anyone. So I'm famous for crying when I get my student feedback. Like if any of the students say it's helped me with my health and it's helped me rethink how I'm going to help my patients when I'm a doctor. But my patients that I see, like the transformation, some of the patients I've had for years, and seeing how their health has transformed and they've achieved the goals they set out, sometimes really tricky ones that, don't know. It's amazing to see. And having that impact on people's health is a complete privilege. It's incredible. Honestly, it completely fuels my passion. What's amazing about ZOE is that we have the ability to impact hundreds of thousands of people. The scale of it is brilliant. And seeing the reviews, the feedback, how it's changed people's lives. My mum is like one of our number one fans.
Is she?
It's completely changed her life. She's a motivation for me. But also, I think on another level, progressing the field forward. People message me on LinkedIn. They're like, you probably will never see this. I always see it. And they'll say, I really want to do that. I really want to move into nutrition. I really want to do more of this. And actually just helping to open that world up more and say, it's important that we have more nutritionists. It's important that it's taken seriously as a science. Try and opt for a degree that is Association for Nutrition accredited so that we can become a workforce for good and we can work to improve health through adequate and accurate nutrition advice, because there is so much noise out there at the moment. It's Wild West with random people saying very actually harmful things, proponents of like a carnivore diet, proponents of all sorts of things that we know the evidence clearly says it's not healthy for the vast majority of the population. That also fuels my fire. And being able to push that forward, that agenda forward, like public health nutrition, actually, we need to change the food environment. I work with politicians, I speak to them, I spend time with them. We talk about what could be done, what are some solutions that we could do. I work with supermarkets. Like I'm very motivated by the whole picture. So individual outcome, for me, it's always the most like sacred because that's a person and you've impacted their life. And I take that very seriously. And then from a zooming out scale, it's like in terms of public health, what can we do at population level? What can we do at education level to actually change the story as well?
Gosh, and so, yeah. I know that what will also be motivating you as the little maestrina is that you're still learning every day.
Yes.
So it's a very exciting field to be in. Thank you so much for making time to record the podcast. I've so been looking forward to talking to you, and I think you've given us some great help, some great tips, and a really wonderful explanation of why we should just enjoy what's on our plate and make sure it's varied and rich, because food is one of our great joys in life, and I imagine it is in your household too, is it?
Yes. And I think, Helen, that's such an important point. I think for so long, food has become feared and we need to avoid it and either try not to eat at all or only eat certain things. And actually, it is one of our greatest joys and it's something that brings us together. It's delicious. It tastes good. It can give you instant joy when you eat it. And in the long-term health, which is in itself like a source of happiness, if we can reconnect with that, and stop fearing food and actually embrace it as such a powerful tool for us. That's what I really want to encourage people to do. It certainly is that for me. That's how I see it. And when I see that transformation in people I work with, where they start they're like, I'm actually enjoying my food again. Like, it's actually really nice. I'm like, this is great. This is what we need more of. So yeah, the joy of food and the power of food are so important. And I think they touch on lots of things like social structure, even taking a break from your day to make lunch, right? It's such an important touch point, and we mustn't lose touch with that because it helps us nourish ourselves and connect with ourselves and the ones we love.
And our 15-year-old will be absolutely thrilled that he can still have his baked beans for breakfast with his eggs, etc. Thank you so much, Federica. Brilliant to talk to you and great to have you on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to Dr. Federica Amati, Head Nutritionist at ZOE and WellFounded, giving us an understanding of what our bodies need to help us thrive throughout our lives. Dr. Federica's book, Everybody Should Know This, is well worth a read and keeping close by to dip into as a really useful, well-written guide. Don't forget to subscribe to our series at convex.podbean.com or search The Convex Conversation on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to yours. I'll be back next week with another great guest. See you then.